Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Bo. And in this Parsha, we have the creation and the birth of the Jewish nation. The 10th plague, Makas Bachoros, the death of the firstborn of the Egyptians, occurs. And afterwards, Paro gives in finally and tells Moshe, take your people and go. And of course, this is the beginning of their path to the desert, to the Midbar Sinai. And eventually, they enter the land of Israel and create a Jewish nation. So it's an extremely important part of the Torah. It's really almost the central and foundational aspect of the Jewish people. But yet, I would argue that the secret of the Jewish people, or the foundation, is not so much the miracles that occurred and the fact that Paro let us out, but it's what happened in the Jewish homes on that night of Pesach. Because that night of Pesach, we were instructed by God through Moshe to bring a carbon Pesach, to bring a paschal offering. We usually call it a lamb, but it's a lamb or a goat. And it has some very special laws associated with it. First of all of the Jewish people have to bring it, which is generally not the case on holidays. It's usually just a communal offering. But here it's every family and every household has to bring an offering. And it says you have to finish it all in one night. If you don't have enough people in your household, you invite guests. You create an extended family, and you invite them, it says specifically. And then it has some other laws. It says that you should not eat it raw, and you shouldn't eat it cooked, but rather only tzliyesh, you should only eat it roasted, which is odd. And then there's another law that says, ve'etzem lo sishbru bo, you shouldn't break any bone, which is also strange. You shouldn't break a bone. What's going on? And then it also tells you that va'ara lo sochabo, that somebody who's uncircumcised is not allowed to partake in the offering. But it says in that same verse that every ger, every stranger, every ezrach, every citizen in the land is allowed to be part of the Pesach offering. And you shouldn't be inclusive, but only inclusive to those that are circumcised. Then there's one other law which is quite interesting, is that if you don't bring the carbon Pesach, if you don't bring this offering, actually the punishment is kares. The punishment is death. And kares, it's not a death by a court, but rather a heavenly punishment. And the word kares literally just means being cut off. So you really cut off, and I would argue cut off from the Jewish people. And interestingly, there's only two positive commandments which have that punishment associated with it. That if you don't perform the positive commandment of bringing the offering on Pesach, and if you don't circumcise. And those two come together on Pesach, that those two things are the ones which go together. It's the only offering which says that if you're uncircumcised, you can't partake in this particular offering. So what's going on? I think the answer is quite simple. Is that the symbolism of the carbon Pesach is really unity. It's Jewish unity. And it's saying that we symbolize this by making sure that we eat it whole. Reb Samson Raphael Hirsch actually makes this comment. He says that if you eat it raw or cook it, it will start falling apart. And if you want to put it in a pot, you can't even fit it into a pot. The only way to keep it whole is to roast it on a fire, and it becomes one whole. And that's the idea of etzem lo sishbru bo. That's why you don't break a bone. Now, it's the essence. Etzem means the bone, but it also we understand it as meaning the essence. What keeps that animal together is the skeletal, the bones of that animal. And those bones you shouldn't break. And you have an extended family when you eat it. And you include those people who decide to join the Jewish people by circumcising themselves. And if you don't circumcise yourself, then you're excluded because you haven't identified as part of the Jewish people. So the secret to the Jewish survival is really not the miracles, which of course were necessary. It's not Moshe, who's also necessary. And even, I would argue, it's not necessarily the Torah, although, of course, we also need that. But the real secret behind it behind our survival and the birth of our nation is unity. And interestingly, there's one other commandment which it says you should eat the Korban Pesach with, which is that you should eat it with matzos umrorim yachlu. You should eat it with matzah and maror and bitter herbs. And what does the matzah represent? There's many different discussions about what matzah represents, but simply, as it says later in the Torah, you went out hurriedly from the land of Egypt. It represents freedom. So the matzah represents freedom, and the maror represents the bitterness and the slavery. It's to take our freedom, but always remember our history. Always remember the suffering. Not that we have to be negative and always be crying or whining about the past, but we have to remember the hardships that we went through. Those hardships helped create and develop that feeling of a unity and a nation. And I think it's quite fitting right now. We're still at the end of a very long war in Israel, and there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a ceasefire. Hostages are being let out. Tomorrow, another group of hostages are let out. It's a time where we see a tremendous amount of unity, and we know Israel has its divisions, as I point out many times, but there's an amazing amount of unity. There's a memory of the hardships, and there's this feeling of family. There's this feeling of we're all one people, and that's what keeps us together. That's why we have, I think, the most, maybe I would argue again, that maybe the most important holiday and ritual that we have, maybe it's not Shabbos, maybe it's not Yom Kippur, and again, you could argue all of these points, but it might be the Pesach and the Seder. And that Seder is a time when we gather together, we gather our family, we do certain rituals, but remember that we're all Jewish and that we're all one large family. And we start, the symbolism is your family or extended family that you invite, but of course it's really saying all of the Jewish people are one extended family. And if we think that way, and if we act that way, and if we feel that way, then we have really not only a chance of survival, but the ability to grow as a nation, as a people, and to grow in peace and prosperity. Good Shabbos.